Forget social distancing, this was a debate like campaigns past. It was back under alert level 1, and the crowd of some 400 people had a clear favourite. It was David Seymour riding a high on his latest poll result. He was feeding off a favourable crowd and landed some solid blows. For what is mostly very clearly national territory here, Paul Goldsmith got a pretty tepid response, while Grant Robertson got a pretty good reception, in fact, from the crowd. Meanwhile, the Greens and New Zealand First largely faded right into the background.
Hard and early when we were the 63rd country to get it. Gold standard contact tracing when one outbreak means 6 weeks of restrictions while the contact tracing catches up. Actually, we need to ask ourselves how we can be Taiwan smart and stop comparing ourselves with the worst. He just said, have you been to Melbourne? Let's start comparing ourselves with the other 5 or 6 states that are doing really well, Grant, and aspire to be better, rather than comparing ourselves with the worst and using fear from the podiumocracy, Grant. We actually need to ask how we can deal with the debt. You know, I've got more young people coming to my meetings, some of them toddlers, and I think they're worried about the debt. I think they've read the pre-fu and they know that they're going to get a driver's license and maybe go to university before this guy sees the New Zealand government balance a budget, because they got 15 years of deficits coming down the track.
Look, debt is an issue for the country. Obviously, everybody understands during a crisis such as this, it's appropriate to borrow. Nobody is going out saying we should be cutting services and slashing and burning. We should borrow to get through this crisis. The question is, how do you plan over the next decade to get that debt back under control so we are prepared for the next crisis that comes along?
It is about a balance. What these guys are proposing will mean there is not enough money for the basics in hospitals.
This is like a scary bedtime story.
And I think everybody assumes that National will be a little bit more careful with your money, and that is an important thing in a time like this.
Not judging on this week.
Because debt serviceability right now is actually more important than the ratio between government debt and GDP. Not a lot of people know this, but a couple of weeks ago, as part of the government's borrowing program, we borrowed $50 million from the markets at a negative interest rate. In other words, we will be paying back less than we borrowed over a 30-year time period.
We inherited massive debt from the National Party when we came into government. They took out massive debt to take us out of the 2008-2009 crisis. They grew the population unsustainably, and everyone's paying it for it now in terms of housing, roading, hospital infrastructure, and all of that. So the question around debt has to be, how do you do it smart, and how do you make sure that businesses can leverage off it in terms of productivity?
I think the reality is that our world has changed, and the private sector, businesses know that they have to live with the new constraints. My question is why the government doesn't do the same thing. And Grant Robertson, this guy's a spendaholic.
The free freeze has been an amazing policy. It's come in. It was designed to create more people going to universities and fewer turned up.
That's right. Labour doesn't even want it anymore either.
It's up there with Kiwi Build as an example of a complete and utter policy failure by this government.
But look, winter energy is the same. Did we have an epidemic of people freezing to death before it came along, or was it an election bribe?
We did have a lot of old people. And one of the messages from David Seymour is don't get old.
Everyone here on this stage wants to get international tourism back into New Zealand, but everyone here on this stage wants to do it safely. And with the proposition from, say, the ACT Party, it kind of sounds good. You might get a few hundred Americans coming spending up large, but the compromise to our border security is massive. And I know from talking to tourism operators here in Queenstown, if we lose our domestic market because we have to shut up again, we're going out of business.
Literally 1 in 3 of our armed forces is deployed at the border. So on the one hand, you want to say you've got to keep us absolutely safe. You want really tight border control. What that means is that we've got the armed forces at the border, we've got police at the border, we've got health professionals at the border, and so on. And that is, it's actually not a shortage of buildings to put people into when they come back. It's the fact that in order to be able to maintain a level of control that people are demanding, quite rightly, That's the kind of human resource that you need to be able to deploy. So if you want to say, look, there are going to be some exceptions to that, and there will be places at the border where you're not going to have the army, and you're not going to have the police, and you're not going to have health professionals, and you're going to turn it over to private contractors, that does open a chink in our armour.
And as entertaining as David Seymour is, he will be in opposition, telling great one-liners and not achieving anything for you. If you want Labour by themselves, by all means. If you want Labour and the Greens, by all means. But the only way that you're going to hold them to account, like we have for the last 3 years, is a party vote for New Zealand First. It's not a marriage proposal, it's just 3 years.
No one was talking about a capital gains tax until those guys put these guys into power. So they're protecting us from the threat they created. What sort of rort is that?